welcome. This is ASAP's Big Picture series to talk to some of our partners, allies, and members of our network to discuss issues of, the structural issues of why things are the way they are. And so today's episode will talk about sexual labor and reproductive labor as, labor issues, as social justice issues, as human rights issues, and why our states, our governments, our societies control these and regulate these to such an extent that most people remain disadvantaged.
Hello everyone, myself Tejaswi. I work with Saheli HIV/AIDS Karyakarta Sangh, which is the only sex work collective in Western Maharashtra, India. And I'm working with this group even before Saheli was born. So for last 25 years, I'm working with sex workers and currently working as the executive director of the organization.
So I am Roula. I'm very happy to be here today with these amazing speakers alongside of you and ASAP. I am a political economist by training, and I have done a lot of work on reproductive justice, which is where my passion is, because I feel it's a great framework to liberate us all, like to find all of these connections with the various groups that are most marginalized. I'm here today as the strategic program coordinator of the International Domestic Workers Federation. The Domestic Workers Federation is the representative of over 580,000 domestic workers around the world through the union movements. So through their individual, whether informal collectives or formal union groups, throughout the entire world where they are organized. So we have representatives in all of the regions, and these domestic workers gather in congresses to do their advocacy and in order to be able to influence policy around the world. So our job is to amplify their voices and to strengthen their advocacy efforts and to improve the unionizing efforts. So we're part of the labor movement primarily, but as we represent domestic workers who come from various walks of life, we also focus on issues of the environment, for example, and reproductive justice and indigenous justice and transgender justice and various forms of oppression that affect the labor, be it physical labor or reproductive labor of our constituencies. So I'm very happy to be discussing this with you today.
Hi everyone, it's my honor to be here with the other speaker, and also thank you for ASAP to inviting me to this panel. So my name is Ignatia. Currently I'm working in Aliansi Satu Visi, network of 20 organizations work for sexual and reproductive health and rights. But in here, I'm as one of the youth champion of Asia Safe Abortion Partnership. I've been with ASAP since 2014, I think. Like it's my first training with ASAP, and it's been a wonderful experience to have a platform where you can share and support each other and discussing about abortion issue, because like as you know, in Indonesia, it's still a very taboo issue and it's often criminalized. Well, actually, we have the regulation that regulate the abortion for some exception, but like the majority still thinks it's criminal. So it's very hard and still a very long process in here.
Yeah, today we are here to address some of the important questions that regulate labor, as all of us work with some form of labor or the other, and and reproductive justice issue is a labor issue. So I would like to ask my first speaker to tell us, share a bit of the context of what you are, the work that you're doing. Why is that work important, and why do you what are the challenges and why those challenges exist? If you have some, we don't need answers, as I said, you could also just leave us with some questions, like,
See, basically, sex workers do exist, even though some people like it or don't like it. They are part of our society. They are human beings. See, I might sound a little bit of sarcastic, but that's the reality. People need to know this also, because that is also might be a beginning for somebody to think about it. So these are very important things. But nobody wants to accept them. They exist, they are there, but nobody wants their existence. So this is the general scenario anywhere, I think, all over the world. And so being a part of the society, nobody wants to make them a part of mainstream society. So these two different words and two different realities do exist in our society. That's the first thing where I think we need to think about sex workers issues from that standpoint. Why they are getting into sex work is become a big debate all over the world, including India. And so people do have their own standpoints looking at sex work. Whether to consider sex work as work, that is also one issue which we are struggling for. God knows how many years we are struggling with that. And the main challenge which we face around sex work is acceptance, accepting that sex work is not just trafficking, because people have a huge fixation around sex work and considering it as 100% trafficking. And they leave no space for voluntary entry into sex work. Nobody considers that, sex workers might be entering into sex work by their choice. So when it comes to having choices, I think that is getting denied all over. So looking at sex work itself becomes a problem for the sex workers' right-based organizations and the other organizations working for other right-based issues, including the feminist organizations. So this has always remained a tussle between different ideologies, I believe. And because sex work is also considered as violence and exploitation all the time, including trafficking, obviously. So this creates a picture that sex work is violence, sex work is trafficking, and it's an exploitative practice. And so for those sex workers who have entered sex work voluntarily as their option for survival, as an option for living their livelihood and taking care of their families, they don't get any space to speak about their own choices, because that choice itself is denied by the society. The society at large thinks sex work as violence, as outcome of patriarchy. Many feminists think on those ideologies, that sex work, because mostly people consider sex workers are women. There are a huge number of men who are also engaged in sex work. There are a huge number of transgenders who are also involved in sex work, but more or less it is always treated as a women's issue. It's a problem. It's an outcome of patriarchy, and that's why even the feminists treat sex workers as a exploitative practice. So when the majority of society have this perception, it ultimately gets reflected into the politics. It ultimately gets reflected in the governance and the law issue. So in most parts of the world, sex work is either getting treated as a crime, maybe completely or maybe partially, and it is denied. The rights of sex workers being as workers are not getting recognized. Forget about accepting and giving them those rights, but it is denied because sex work is not treated as work. So the criminalization part of sex work and sex workers create a very huge impact on their lives and made it very difficult for them to survive like common human beings in any part of the world. So this is the main issue. Sex workers have started getting attention from the activists, social workers, and NGOs because of HIV. Nobody can deny that. Because of HIV, the people have started paying attention to them. Now HIV is still there. Nobody is denying that, but we need to move a little bit ahead from just being a healthcare provider to the right-based organizations. And many sex workers organizations, collectives, and activists working with sex workers have done that journey. Now we have moved from just HIV prevention and health issues to the right-based approach, and speaking about voluntary sex work and decriminalization, and why decriminalization of sex work and sex workers is necessary, because it is going to be the only way sex workers are going to get a dignified life, because they are not criminals. They are human beings like you and me. And so society and law needs to treat them as human beings, as citizens of any country. So that's the demand we are asking for.
So thank you for bringing some very important points for a lot of the audiences who would probably hear about the issues around sex work for the first time. Very important point to remember, that as long as we don't look at labor as like human beings as legal, labor as a justified decriminalized labor, we will not be able to bring or demand justice for those set of people. So I think it's a very important point to remember. And but just one follow-up question, Tejaswi. If you could talk a little bit about why this attitude towards sex workers, and why, after so many years of demanding decriminalization, sex work is still not looked at as legitimate labor. What are your thoughts on it?
I think the basic perception of any community, for that matter, who consider themselves as, based on very high moral standards. I think this is a question of individuals' own ideologies and the ideologies we are carrying forward from generations to generations of morality, because when sex happens within within marriage or a family, it is considered as, very important thing. It should be there. If somebody, some woman denies to have sex with a man, her husband, she is treated very badly in the family. But when that same activity is done for, earning money or earning livelihood, that is considered as immoral. So I think the notion of morality, how society look at it, I think it starts from there.
The whole concept of morality, and how it is being passed down from one generation to another, and it is becoming a way to control, because none of us are like allowed to question, because we are being told that this is good and that is bad, but why is it good and why is it bad are not things that we are asked to or encouraged to question. So thank you so much, Tejaswi, for bringing those points. And we will come back later on, and maybe we can have an open discussion with all the speakers. But I think that I would like to ask my next speaker, Roula, to come in and share, because these are very similar issues, what we just shared. So, but if you can also talk a little bit about the work that you do and the kind of issues that you face, and why do you think those issues exist?
Okay, a lot of this resonates, definitely. So I would like to start from the place that we consider domestic work to be the form of work that makes all other forms of work possible. And I feel that this is relatable to everybody who's listening in and understand that the labor that the women and their families have done historically and continue to do, whichever background they come from. The difference is that within the sector, when we're talking about domestic work as remunerated work or as paid labor, we encounter a pushback from the society, from patriarchy, from capitalism, from misogyny, that says, why should we pay for a job that women have done historically for free? And this is the major backlash. And we find that a lot of also women, like that try to be allies to the domestic workers movement, kind of understand it from an ally perspective, which is not necessarily always helpful, because it puts certain boundaries that bring in a savior complex into the industry, saying that, for example, poor, disadvantaged, marginalized women, we will like call for justice that affects the sector, whereas these women are underpaid, undervalued, abused, unprotected. because of a labor that is historically performed by women for free. So a liberation or justice for the domestic workers would inevitably affect also the status of women. And once we understand those intersections in the fights that we're leading together, we would be able to do solidarity work more prominently and to kind of alleviate, instead of working in silos, right? Instead of understanding that this is a labor issue that is not related to feminist justice issues, to reproductive justice issues, to all other forms of justice related to racial justice, for example, and migration. Speaking of racial justice, in the sector, we also experience, and this is linked to the questions that we're asking also about reproduction. So women have historically reproduced societies through the very function of reproduction, in the sense of reproducing communities, both physically and both in terms of the culture, in terms of safeguarding certain norms, in terms of passing this morality, but also reproducing life and livelihoods through the domestic work and the care work that they do within their houses. And when we look at the sector, the women employed in domestic work that is paid usually are women from the global south. They are women of color. They are women from underprivileged classes, from underprivileged castes. They are also at times facing justice that intersects with other sectors. For example, being that this labor is physical, once they are not able to perform a manual form of labor, they are understood disposable. So we are looking at capitalism that treats us as only able-bodied and only valuable, but not even valuable because they're underpaid, if they are able to perform this labor, and yet it calls it unskilled. Tell me what is unskilled about working 12 to 14 hours a day, curing people, caring for them, reproducing this life, this livelihood, doing the cooking, the cleaning, the raising, the everything that a domestic worker would do within the private household that is not her own, and that is, she is invisible there because of the conflation of the space of employment and the space of living, in case she is a live-in domestic worker, which also obscures or makes the injustices she faces invisible to the public sphere. So whatever happens in private, sometimes we don't see it, we don't hear about it. And also we cannot grant sometimes forms of support that would be available to other sectors. Say domestic violence laws in many countries, they protect women or they protect people from violence that happens within the household. But this is only in case these women have a relationship of kinship or familiarity with the people. So if we're looking at a domestic worker within the private household, in most cases, she would not be protected against domestic violence because the law does not see her, because she's not, like, she's a domestic worker, but she's not protected from domestic violence. And it is the same in countries that do not recognize domestic work as work. She is not protected by any provisions against like violence and harassment at work, because domestic work is not work for these countries. So they find themselves like stuck in situations with very little support. And this is because of a number of things: the invisibility of the sector, the unrecognition of the labor, and also the inherent racism that the sector has been built on. And we're talking about racial capitalism in this sense. For example, when we look at the implicit color scale and the pay rates that domestic workers are having, the fairer the skin, the more they get paid, even though very little. And this creates fractions within the movement itself, because there is a preferential treatment that we inherit from racism, from colorism, also from slavery, because a lot of the passage of policy within the domestic work sector has been influenced by slavery. I will mention one example. In the contexts where domestic workers are living, I will take the example of my context here. In the Middle East, there is a system called the kafala system, which is the guardianship system, yes, which is also incredible, that an adult that is a migrant woman that travels halfway across the world to make a life and a living for her family is treated as a minor, and that a Lebanese citizen, in my context, because I'm in Lebanon, would have full ownership over all the actions that she might take, over her status of documentation. Her visa would be tied to them, the conditions of her work, the conditions of her stay in this country, so all of this. And she would be a live-in worker. And in case she decides, what we call in other sectors, quit the job, in case she wants to quit the job, they are in full authority to go report her to the police for absconding her duties. This is a flashback to the times of slavery, when a runaway slave would be followed by like the racist, I don't know, white supremacists, and brought back to the justice. So like these are forms of practices that are common, that we see till today, and that are direct inheritance from the times of slavery. And yet we dare to speak of post-colonial times, or like post-racial times, or that we have gotten rid of all of these practices when we did not. This is also because of the economic factor. I feel sometimes when we talk about the kafala and the migration and a lot of struggles that domestic workers face, sometimes they are understood as cultural, and this is not necessarily true, because they are very much economic. And the difference is, when we feel that a struggle that they're facing is cultural, we're fighting back at an ideology, which we should do by changing the norms, of course, but we also need to look at the structural causes behind it. Since domestic workers perform a lot of care work, this means that governments can displace the care work that should be performed by institutions and make it the individual responsibility of a woman from a lower class, from a vulnerable position, from the global south, who is a migrant, that would not have access to protect herself and to call for certain rights, to perform all of this labor. And by doing this, they're saving up big chunks of the budgets that should be spending on the well-being and livelihoods of the people here. So domestic workers are a big part of the care economy. They are the people who care for us, and we should care for them. We should provide care work and care services, and in general also care for these workers that make all other forms of work possible. Despite the trouble that also Tejaswi talked about in terms of the race to innocence, in terms of how patriarchy and capitalism divide between us, but by making us buy into narratives of certain people being worthier than others, or certain labor being worthier than other, being it unskilled versus skilled labor, which is a myth, being it like uneducated versus educated labor, and all other forms of binaries that we need to fight, and that we feel sometimes we're buying into because we live in a patriarchal world, and we know that we are more protected once we subscribe to these narratives, and that there is something to lose if we don't. So I'm happy to be here with you today to contemplate how we can see justice collectively for all of our movements.
Yes, thank you so much, Roula. As usual, I have many points in my mind and follow-up questions for you as well. I want to hear you talk about a bit about the whole issue of migration and migrant, workers, because during COVID, when a lot of working like industries and all, factories and a lot of places closed down, and not necessarily domestic workers, but a lot of people had to migrate back home within the country. So this is internal. And they had to like walk all the way for thousands of kilometers. The government actually did not provide them any assistance, no money, no food, no transport. It was I think a huge calamity that happened. And but at the same time, there's also the migration that happens across borders. And we all know our borders are all colonial constructs. They were, drawn on a map, literally like on one fine night. Somebody over a peg of a whiskey drew a line and then said, this is your country and this is your country. So how, if you can just talk a little bit about that, the migration and nationalism and the, militarization of that's affecting our, labor issues.
Okay, I also like, since you're bringing up the narratives that we can hear amongst our own constituencies about certain jobs being better than others, and like this goes also, this is true for the specialization within the sector, so within domestic work itself, not even in domestic work vis-a-vis other forms of labor. This is because of this race towards innocence, right? And like how the society forces us to use respectability in order to have any leverage in the world. It's kind of like our mothers that have told us, don't do this, don't date that boy, don't date that girl, like, oh my God, right?
Yes, yes.
And trying to protect us from the society, but also protect themselves, because eventually they would have been conceived as bad mothers if they hadn't done that. And I think we reproduce that in our relationships with other women. But what we hold true at the Domestic Workers Federation is that we are a labor movement, and we're pushing for the unionizing of workers. And so unionizing is something that we see happening across all of the sectors, regardless whether they're understood as legitimate work or not legitimate work by various fractions of the society. I mean, domestic work is understood as something that women are supposed to be giving for free. And this is probably something that resonates with sex worker movements in terms of the labor that is done within the households. So yes, I mean, we push for worker unionizing. And since we're a membership-based organization, we have women from different walks of life, and they stand differently on the issue, but we're having the conversations constantly and regularly. Most recently, we have had a composite resolution on building an inclusive federation that speaks of LGBTQ rights, that speaks of anti-Black racism, that speaks of Islamophobia, that speaks of various, what you were saying earlier, Nandini, that we don't come from single issue lives. So it's a little bit about that, about the intersectionality of our sector with the other struggles that women are facing. And this also brings us to migration in terms of the choice. This is something that Tejaswi was talking about earlier. When we think of migration in the macro sense, people kind of valorize that if it's a migration by choice, then that's a high-skilled laborer, then this might be okay, then they are not trafficked. And migrant domestic workers frequently come into countries through third pathways if there are legal challenges to their entry, or we see sometimes also the countries of origin closing the border to passage to the country of destination because that country treats domestic workers horribly. And in effort to protect them, they just close the border. But what happens is that these workers come through a third country and then find themselves not protected by their own governments, not protected by the governments of the countries of their destination, and find themselves all alone. We also saw, for example, in Europe, a conflation between trafficking and smuggling that was meant to scare humanitarian organizations from assisting migrants escaping horrible situations, because then they would charge them for trafficking because or smuggling, because they would, because of the conflation, right? Like it's not one and the same thing,
yeah.
But like the element of choice and how choice is treated. So for example, when we think of migration, choice is a primary thing. Like if you ended up there because of your horrible conditions, or you used unlawful pathways to go to a country, then like that is not legitimate. We either want to save you or to punish you, depends on the context. But then again, like when we think of what Tejaswi was saying, that the choice of the worker is not validated if she chooses a certain form of labor. So are we into making this choice something that is available, or not making the choice something that is available? And how is this victimizing narrative affecting the workers within the sectors that we work in? Borders are obviously something that is artificial, that has been frequently drawn by a colonizer. And in the language of debt, our countries that have been colonized are the countries that provide care work a lot of times to countries within the global north in the context of migration. And so they benefit their economies and the economies of the home countries through the remuneration, but it is not recognized in the grand scheme of things because it's not even calculated within the GDP. If we think about macroeconomics in the very standardized understanding of what macroeconomics is and what goes into the production of value and the production of life. So how capitalism actually depends on labor that is unpaid in order to accumulate the wealth. And it also depends on making it invisible. And this is the most flagrant example today. We can see it within the global chain of migration and how women from poorer contexts migrate to like more advantaged contexts. And that means that an unpaid woman in their own household takes over the care work that they were supposed to be doing because patriarchy makes it their responsibility.
Yes, and absolutely amazing points there, Rola. I think very important points for all of us to think, because some of these issues are common for all of us. Igna, so I was just wondering if you could speak a bit about the safe abortion movement in Indonesia, because I know there has been a lot of challenges, including people. Actually, we've lost people. So what I want to, because why is this important, is what the issues that Tejaswi brought up or Rola brought up have deep connections with the safe abortion issue.
Yes.
So the women you may not work directly with sex workers or domestic workers, but so many women come to you or call you or reach out to you for safe abortion services, or people and they will never identify because of the taboo around sex work. Nobody will come and say, hey, I'm a sex worker, but you are probably meeting and helping people like that. So your work is extremely important, but we just want to know for our audiences the context of safe abortions in Indonesia. How difficult it is, what are the challenges, what is the current situation? And because ultimately the constituencies that Tejaswi talked about or Rola talked about, they are they're there, and in Indonesia, if they live there, what are the kind of challenges they are facing, and why do you think that is the situation? Like, just from the perspective of someone who's worked on safe abortion rights. So if you could talk a bit about that.
Oh, okay. So I could just talk specifically on the safe abortion condition in Indonesia.
Yes.
Okay. So as I mentioned previously, like currently the regulation is there. That is the exception for women to get the abortion service under two conditions, which is medical emergency and pregnancy due to rape. But for the rape case itself, the gestational age is only until 40 days, which is impossible for women to realize that they're pregnant at that time. So basically, even though the regulation is there, like the access is still difficult. And even though the regulation is already being passed since years ago, the implementation is not there yet. Basically, the government should appoint the medical facility that will deliver the service. But unfortunately, until today, the government doesn't appoint any health facility yet. So it's become a confusion between the society. Like sometimes you think, is it legal? Is it illegal? Or what is the status? And therefore there is some organization that try to fulfill the gap. But I couldn't mention the organization because it will be dangerous for them.
Yes, completely understandable.
But there is some hotline, some clinic that provide the safe abortion service, but they need to be really careful because you can get raped by the police, you can get arrested, you can go to jail and something like that. So but basically, like the misoprostol is available. I mean, like you can buy it online in here, but on the marketplace. But they don't give you like the exact prescription on how to use that and how many pills you should use that. Sometimes, or most of the seller from the black market is giving you the fake pills, and which is it's very difficult for women to go through that phase. So that's basically the condition in Indonesia. And and yeah, even though there is some clinic, there is some hotline that provide the service, we cannot like publish it publicly that we give you that service. But sometimes we tell people, we do a publication like we give you the counseling on unplanned pregnancy. So like that's the maximum publication that we can do here in Indonesia. And to be honest, I don't work directly. I mean, like I don't work in the clinic or in the hotline, but I work closely with them. So like when women or there is case related to unplanned pregnancy, usually I do the referral system toward the clinics and also the hotline. But since the pandemic happened, it's a bit hard for some of the hotline service here in Indonesia to get the medicine, because like mostly we got it from outside Indonesia, sometimes from India if I'm not mistaken. So since like the border is closed, the process of delivering the medicine has become too long, or sometimes the medicine doesn't even delivered here to Indonesia. So it's a bit hard for women to access the medical abortion during this pandemic. And also for the clinic itself, since we need to do like the social distancing, like for some months when the pandemic happened, most of the clinic is closing their service for a couple of months. So a lot of women cannot access the service itself. And when when the clinic already opened the service, they need to like limited the number of women who can access it. And unfortunately, like on the last August, there is some incident happen. One of the clinic that giving the safe abortion service to women is getting raped by the police, and some of the doctors and also the staff is arrested. So it's become a nightmare from the other clinic. Like we need to slow down for a bit. Some of them already closed their service for quite a while, and I just know maybe one or two that start to open again earlier this year. So yeah, it's a bit of challenge in here in Indonesia.
Thank you, thank you, Ignatia. That was a very important sharing. And, it basically connects everything that we've been saying, that Tejaswi has said, Roula has said, that the whole political economy of labor, the global south is actually the source of labor. And so it makes very much, like if you connect the dots, the big picture is basically you control the choices, reproductive choices of people, whether they can terminate or not, and just take away the right to terminate completely, because this is literally taking that right away, and make sure that you continue to have abundance of human resource that can then again migrate, whether and whatever the choices they have, because we all know that our countries also struggling with economies. So it's not that there are jobs available internally. So we'll have probably many people who will migrate for those low paid exploitative jobs, whether it's as a domestic worker or whether it's as a sex worker. And then and that's how patriarchy and capitalism can continue running. So if, like, to me, that is the big picture. But I think this was a great conversation to have. I think we have done well with the time. We had a 1 hour slot, and I think we're coming to close to an hour. We have 10 more minutes. So if I can pass on the mic again to Tejaswi, the imaginary mic to Tejaswi and to Roula and Igna, also you, like, if you can, so for me, this was an aha moment when Igna spoke. I could see the whole thing come together. And to me, this is the whole problem, which, this whole, why is this happening? So Tejaswi, if you have some, final concluding observations to make, because this is, our struggle with the sex workers movement is similar. And, this is also the situation with them. And we all know how difficult it is for them to access all kinds of services. And of course, abortion has always been challenging. And now in India, we have the UID, the Aadhaar. And even though the abortion services are supposed to be available to anyone within a certain age, certain time limit, but they are making, like the Abortion Act is very pro-medical, like for the service providers, and not really for the women. They're not. It's not a rights-based act. So a lot of times, it is totally depends on who is interpreting the law and how. So a lot of the times I know that sex workers are being told to go away and bring the ID cards, bring the partner's ID cards, completely, bizarre things happening. So Tejas, if you could just talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I will just narrate the incidences. Few cases happened during this lockdown. Sex workers, first of all, when sex workers go for abortion, the service provider will look at her as if she has made a big scene, not just a crime, but big scene. Like, how could a sex worker can get pregnant? That she is not using safe sex methods, which is always a blame. But they don't think even that she might be having a husband, she might be having a lover, her partner. So from him, she might be conceived, and now she has decided to go for abortion. So that's the first thing usually sex workers do face. During lockdown, we have some incidences where sex workers have tried to go for abortion services, but the hospitals were so full of COVID cases, nobody was paying attention. And see, sex workers usually access the government facilities where they ask lots of documents. And so the priority was completely for COVID. Many women were not able to access. There was a shortage of other family planning methods apart from condom. Condom shortage was also there, but the oral pills were not there. Other property was not available because many NGOs were also not functioning at that time. Their clinics were shut down. So nothing was moving ahead, and so all those issues they have faced. We have wholeheartedly welcomed the advisory by NHRC during this period. NHRC has declared that sex workers should be considered as informal and unorganized sector labor, and welcome it so wholeheartedly. But again, as usual, we face tremendous backlash by the abolitionist and so-called anti-trafficking organization. The pressure was so much that unfortunately NHRC has changed that advisory, and they have said that we have mentioned this just because for the COVID situation. So it was, it was
a big loss.
It's a big loss for the movement. And, again, the entire issues of accessing the abortion services, safe abortion services, sex workers have faced tremendously. Because, even leaving the red light area, going to access abortion was a big issue. Those sex workers who are going for their ART, it was easier for them because they were having the card, and those were helping them out to get a police permission. But for accessing abortion service was a big nightmare for sex workers, and some of them continue with the pregnancy, and now they are facing so many issues with that. So this was a situation during COVID.
Yes, thank you so much, Tejaswi. I think that is a very important point, and what COVID actually did. And I think we cannot have this conversation without acknowledging the pandemic, which basically has just brought out how badly broken this world is. It's not created any new, I think, issues, but it's just made it very visible and naked for all of us to see right now. And I think moving forward, we really have to see what is the kind of changes and we have to bring those changes, and we have to work for them. So reproductive justice from a rights-based framework is what we believe in as the safe abortion movement, because it's not about who can reproduce or who cannot. It has to be dependent on the individual and completely be the choice that they want to exercise that choice. It should be a rights-based and a justice issue for sure, because ultimately we really need to free ourselves from these clutches of patriarchy and capitalism and claim our lives, the right to leisure, the right to work, and a right to work with dignity and safety, and our freedoms, and all of these, and they are all interconnected in everything that all of you brought in. So thank you so much.